will have joined. So a really warm welcome to this session on planning for flood risk. My name's Dr. Hugh Ellis, and I'm Director of Policy at the TCPA. We've got quite a focused agenda. I will say some very brief comments about how this is going to operate, and then we're going to move on to a really brilliant panel. And as with last week's session, if you're on it, we've got an Environment Agency panel, Sandrine Thomas and Andrew Pattinson are going to be talking about flood risk assessments. And in the background, some other Environment Agency colleagues who we hope will be able to deal with your questions. So just some technical details before we start. Session's being recorded because it will be used as part of a wider training program that the TCPA and the Environment Agency is running to try to support local authority plan making and decision makers. That's going to be rolled out over the next few months. So there's quite a few things to look out for, including some e-learning resources. I think it's absolutely clear to say to everyone on this call that there's a really different mixed set of expectations and skills in relation to these issues. So there's no stupid questions on this session. And if you want to ask a question, the way to do it is to put it in the Q&A function. We're not dealing with them in any other way today. So if you've got an issue or a technical problem, please put it in the Q&A. That's partly, I think, because of my age and limited capacity to do two things at the same time. So if you could put questions in the Q&A, that would be really great. You won't be able to see all the questions in the Q&A, but from last week's session, we were sort of getting 60 or 70, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of this session. We hope to try and deal with as many as we can, but we will be capturing all of them, and they will be reflected back in the training resources that we're producing over time. So just by word of introduction, I think from our knowledge so far of the hard work and commitment of lots of local authority planners in an incredibly difficult situation about skills and capacity, you're caught between quite a challenging agenda, aren't you? On one side, there is those skills and capacity and the need to make urgent progress with local plans. And if you want my opinion, there is no reason and should be no reason for delay local plan making. The issues involved are far too important for us to try to do that. We need to crack on. We really, really do, particularly in dealing with climate change. But you're also caught between those real capacity issues and the complexity and increasing magnitude of climate change. I won't talk about that. You will understand how important that's going to be. But there's one word that I should have used last week in the session, which I have been reflecting on, and that's the dynamism, the dynamic nature of climate change. That's to say that in making plans, the risks you face now are not the risks you're going to face in 5 to 10 years. And they're certainly not the risks that you're going to face in 50 to 100 years. You must be planning for a 100-year time horizon to reflect how climate change will impact. And that is challenging to try to achieve, and it's challenging to try to communicate to the public. But that's what we need to do to create successful and resilient places. I also think that climate change has to be at the front and center of local plan making because it is primarily an economic and social issue. If you cannot demonstrate resilience in a community, you cannot demonstrate an economic and hopeful pathway, because you will not be able to afford insurance and you won't get investment if you can't manage the risks that are arising from climate change. So in relation to today's session, we've got Sandrine and Andrew, two experts from the Environment Agency, to tackle one of the most significant foundational issues in good plan making and good decision making. That's to say, we have to understand risk, and the flood risk assessments is the critical way that we understand that risk. And so in that vital context, it's about trying to understand how these FRAs work and to try to answer any questions and uncertainties that there may be in your mind about how they're operating. You can't do your job properly unless flood risk assessments are of the right quality, are up to date, and are delivering sort of the right level of detail. So without any more conversation from me, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to take you through the first part of the presentation. Andrew.
Good afternoon. Yeah, thanks, Hugh, for that great introduction. Thanks to the TCPA for hosting this session and for all of you taking your time out of your busy lunch times to attend our session. We hope you find it beneficial. By way of a brief introduction, I'm Andrew Pattinson, and I'm co-presenting today with Sandrine Thomas, my colleague, with Development Planning Advisors in the Environment Agency's national team, and we focus on flood risk and spatial planning matters. I'm going to set out. We do have some interactive polls later on before the open Q&A session. so please look out for some hints as we go through the presentation. If I could, next slide, please. So I think we should first start with what a flood risk assessment is. These are carried out by developers when proposing development in flood risk areas, with the objective of ensuring they meet the necessities of the NPPF's policy requirements on flood risk and ensuring that development is safe over its lifetime. We're talking today about site-specific flood risk assessments, but at times we'll also refer to strategic flood risk assessments, or SFRAs. So the planning practice guidance sets out key aspects that a good FRA will need to demonstrate, which includes whether it's a flood risk from any source that affects the development over its lifetime, meaning taking the impacts of climate change into account. And in light of those identified risks, what mitigation would be required to make that development safe. Also need to ensure that if development increases flood risk to others, that it considers the mitigation that might be necessary to bring it back in line with the NPPF. And fundamentally, that an FRA will need to use the best available evidence when it's being produced. So objectives for the presentation are to show how flood risk assessment can help you better understand flood risk, to understand where you can go for more information around flood risk, including the importance of SFRAs, when you might need to consult with others and what you can do with this information, and again, fundamentally making sure that good planning decisions in light of that flood risk information are taken. So the first few slides I've got provide a bit more detail about what is included in a good FRA, why these aspects are important. But as we move through, we're going to focus on some of the key elements and highlight their importance. We'll also talk about how flood risk assessment can contribute positively to making climate resilient places. Next slide, please. For those of you who attended the previous webinar on sequential exceptions test, you might be familiar with this flood risk management hierarchy shown on the screen. A site-specific flood risk assessment is important within all of these steps, and it should complement and enhance the strategic assessment carried out through your local plan on allocated sites. And for windfall sites, it should allow you to carry out a stepwise assessment to apply a sequential approach. The first step is always to assess the flood risk, and this should build on any known understanding of flood risk issues, for example, within your SFRA. But where the SFRA was strategic in nature, you're looking for a site-specific FRA to enhance that understanding. The sequential approach follows this assessment. This includes the application of the sequential test, which at its strongest can avoid flood risk entirely, but will ensure that sites at the lowest flood risk overall are taken forwards. Only once a development has passed the sequential test should it move on to the exceptions test, but please do refer back to the previous webinars for more details. The control, mitigate, and manage stages are principally here to reduce exposure to flood risk, and Sandrine will discuss some of the content of these sections later. Each step has corresponding guidance notes in the planning practice guidance, and we'll talk also about additional signposts where you can obtain other information to help you make decisions. These things are important because they not only eliminate the direct damages to property, but indirectly they reduce the exposure to knock-on consequences, such as displacement of people from homes, which can often be for weeks or months, the impact on livelihoods, and the negative impacts on things like mental health. Just as I get started here, later on when I hand over to Sandrine, you'll see some red text appearing in the top right corner of the slides, which will help you see where we are when we're talking about this hierarchy. Okay, next slide, please. So why are flood risk assessments important? A good quality flood risk assessment will help make good decisions around all sorts of flood risk, including fluvial, tidal, surface water, groundwater, reservoir, canal, and other artificial sources of risk. An FRA will investigate whether a site is at flood risk now or in the future from any of these sources, ensuring that those changes are well understood. It will build on the picture of risk presented in your SFRA. The FRA will provide credibility to your SFRA, and it could include more contextual, granular details at site level. For example, it might enhance elements of existing models, or it may provide flood depth and hazard information. It might also take into account new flood infrastructure or recently completed flood alleviation schemes. In assessing the future impacts of climate change and flood risk, this will help ensure that development is resilient. In making a development safe, it must not transfer risk to others, and this will require robust assessment. A development that increases flood risk should not be permitted. There are options available to compensate or offset flood storage and conveyance, and in some cases, this can contribute positively to reducing flood risk overall or providing multifunctional benefits. An FRA must also demonstrate the development is in line with any relevant policies. So, for example, there may be local plan policies relating to managing development in coastal change areas. There could be links with contributions for flood and coastal risk infrastructure, or it could look to safeguard land that may be required in the future. Flood risk assessments therefore contribute to ensuring that the policies set out in the local plan are adhered to and ensure consistent parameters are provided for development coming forwards. The flood risk assessment document itself is owned by the developer. It is their assessment of flood risk to own. And in most cases, they will ask a qualified consultant to work to produce this for them. A flood risk assessment will be proportionate to its scale, location, and the anticipated flood risk to its development. So if you do have a good strategic flood risk assessment, you're likely to have better insight at this point to understand what additional investigations a FRA should consider. It's worth pointing out this point here that in cases where a planning application needs to be supported by a flood risk assessment, but one isn't provided, this could be grounds for not validating an application. And next slide, please. So the footnote 55 of the MPPF makes it really clear when a flood risk assessment is required, and this takes into account all sources of current and future flood risk, not just flood zones 2 and 3 associated with rivers and the sea. So in flood zone 1, which is land shown on the EA's flood map, not at risk in an extreme flood event, an FRA is still required if there is risk from surface water or groundwater or artificial sources like reservoirs or canals, if the development will increase its vulnerability. An FRA is also required if a site is shown to be at increased flood risk because of the effects of climate change, or if the site is in flood zone 1 for a development greater than 1 hectare. To apply this to a site, you should use the Environment Agency flood map for planning and your strategic flood risk assessment. And these should offer you the evidence to apply these parameters. If your SFRA doesn't provide these, it would be a good point to look at revisiting this now. Or if you don't have that information, you can use the check your long-term flood risk pages to provide information. Just point out here, this is a subtle hint that it might come up in some of the poll questions later on. So yeah, please do make a note of things on this page. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So your role as decision makers, you shouldn't accept applications without an FRA where one is needed. Your local list of information requirements or validation checklist could make this abundantly clear. It's important to have the right information up front to avoid delays. So if you do consult the Environment Agency with a flood risk assessment missing where is one required, they're likely to object. So do have a think early on whether you're able to withhold or delay validation if this information is missing. You'll obviously need to consult widely on flood risk matters, and there are a number of risk management authorities who may wish to provide comments. I'll outline a few of the key ones here. So starting with the Environment Agency, they are a statutory consultee on flood risk for most development in flood zones 2 and 3, and also within 20 metres off main rivers, in line with the 2015 DMPO. And for low risk development and locations, National Flood Risk Standing Advice can apply. There's a specific landing page on the .gov web pages with relevant details. And some Environment Agency teams have supplemented this with something called Local Flood Risk Standing Advice. I recommend that you discuss this with your relevant local Environment Agency contacts to see if there is such available. The EA retains a strategic oversight role on all sources of flood risk. So whilst these don't result in additional consultation triggers through planning, further commentary may be made when the EA respond to your consultations. The lead local flood authority are also statutory consultee, but on major development in flood zone 1, and they lead on managing local flood risks from surface water and groundwater. There may be special local arrangements relevant to your LFAs. Emergency planners also could be a vital consultation link, and you should think about this when looking at development in flood risk areas. Sandrine's going to talk later on about circumstances where emergency planning is offered to manage flood risks, and some of the responsibilities around deciding if this is considered appropriate and effective. Consultation may also be beneficial with local resilience forums. So please refer to your local plan and SFRA to decide if consultation with emergency planners and LRFs is important. There are obviously circumstances where an FRA is required, but where you may not have the benefit of being able to access expert advice. There is an FRA checklist here that can help you review the content of the FRA, but again, refer back to your SFRA, which may offer some insight, particularly into these consultation knowledge gaps. Okay, next page, please. So this slide explains how different authorities are involved in managing flood risk. Starting at the outer edge, the Environment Agency have a strategic overview on all sources of flood risk. It does this by providing national data and information and tools on flooding and coastal change, most of which is available publicly. The EA leads on effective partnerships that enable place shaping to manage flood and coastal change and exercise a general supervision on flooding and coastal change in England. We've also produced a national FCRM strategy, the latest version published in 2020. Moving towards the centre of the graphic, specific flood risk is managed by various risk management authorities. The EA manages flood risk from main rivers, the sea and estuaries, builds defences and other flood infrastructure. The EA informs and warns about risk from these sources, including during flood incidents. And the EA also leads and manages on flood risk associated with reservoirs. Other risk management authorities lead on other forms of flood risk. So who you need to consult with depends on the risks relevant in your area. For example, around a third of planning authorities interact with the coastal tidal risks, where coastal protection authorities are involved, and IDBs are more likely in low-lying areas with complex drainage needs. Specifically in planning, the consultation rule doesn't necessarily match this oversight rule. So for the Environment Agency, the statutory consultation is somewhat limited, shown by the red text on the right-hand side. We see development proposed in areas at present-day risk of flooding from rivers or sea. This means the Environment Agency is not a statutory consultee on future flood risk, surface water risk, groundwater risk, reservoir risk, and proximity to all flood defences, whilst the lead local flood authority is a statutory consultee on major development with surface water drainage. So it's worth noting that there are significant sources of flood risk where the EA or the lead local flood authority won't be providing expert advice, and where decision maker will have to step up to satisfy themselves that these risks are appropriately considered and addressed. Next slide, please. So having set out all of that context as to why flood risk assessments are important, let's start delving into some of the essential components of the FRA and key hooks embedded with the MPPF and PPG. Now, before you consider the sequential exceptions test, it's worth checking whether the proposed development is fundamentally incompatible with flood risk, and you can do that by referring to Table 2 of the PPG, which is shown on the screen. By establishing the flood zone of the development vulnerability classification, you can check whether development should not be permitted. And if it is incompatible, this is likely to be grounds for refusal. And if you recognise this now, you can save the developer, consultees and yourselves time and cost later on. However, if it's not incompatible, we can move on. So next slide, please. Okay, so going back to the flood risk management hierarchy, which is shown on this page, the practitioners should be asking these questions when reviewing a flood risk assessment. And remember that this is a hierarchy. Start at the top and work your way down. It's not a race to the bottom. We could use this to ensure that where development is necessary in flood risk areas, that it will be safe for its lifetime without increasing risk elsewhere. So if we add some context to the remaining steps of the hierarchy, this will help us understand what we mean. So the assess stage is what we've been talking about. It will ensure we've got the best available information to work from. In the avoidance stage, the flood risk assessment should include evidence that the sequential test has been applied by the local planning authority when allocating the site or when looking at a windfall development. We should remember that it is now the local planning authority's responsibility to apply the sequential test, even for windfall sites. Avoidance techniques here could also be considered by looking at site layout, horizontally and vertically within sites, through risk substitution, which could be proposing lower vulnerability uses in the highest risk areas, or avoidance by raising ground or floor levels. Under control, this stage it could include opportunities for contributions to flood and coastal risk management schemes, or making space for water within the site through ground level modifications. This essentially creates safe flood storage areas or flow routes within the site. Under the mitigation heading, the question we're asking here is what further mitigation has been proposed to keep people safe in and around buildings. Things like safe access and egress routes that provide free and voluntary movement. Compensatory storage proposals might fall in mitigation as well. The buildings themselves, we need to look at whether they've been designed and are appropriately flood resistant and resilient. Once all the mitigation is taken into account, we need to look at how any remaining or residual flood risks are managed, which is the bottom heading. Is there a flood warning and evacuation plan? If the FRA is dependent on emergency procedures, has an emergency planner or an LRF been involved in that? Next slide, please. So planning decisions need to take the predicted impacts of climate change into account over the expected lifetime of development. This is usually 100 years for residential, and the PPG now confirms that for non-residential, the default should be 75 years. The lifetime of the development will influence which climate change allowances need to be referred to. If you've consulted the Environment Agency, they will check the FRA to ensure the correct allowances are applied to the assessment of flood risk. But as we explained earlier, there are likely to be cases where the Environment Agency are not consulted, where you'll need to form an opinion on whether the assessment is acceptable. Once again, your SFRA could help you here, but let's assume you need to perform the checks yourself and provide some checkpoints. The .gov webpage contains links to the allowances that should be used. This includes allowances for peak river flow, peak rainfall intensity, and also coastal information such as sea level rise, offshore wind speed, and extreme wave height. The webpage contains additional guidance explaining which allowances to use depending on the development, its lifetime. For example, peak river flow contains links to an interactive map for management catchments. And for accounting for sea level rise, a table is provided that gives you incremental uplifts that are applied per year. These allowances can then be taken forward within a FRA to consider the impacts of climate change on flood risk to a development. The subsequent approach will be commensurate with the scale and nature of development and its flood risk setting. For example, a developer that needs to undertake further modelling may be more required in areas of complex flood risk or with sensitive development, whereas smaller scale householder extensions may take a more simplistic approach. Often a competent flood risk assessment author will be able to provide a credible conclusion by referring to existing modelling, your SFRA, or any relevant standing advice. So that comes to the end of my section. Just as I pass over to Sandrine, just a reminder to keep an eye on the top right corner. So it will keep you on track of where we are sitting within the flood risk management hierarchy. And over to you, Sandrine.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so I'm going to, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Sally. So just to remind you about the functional floodplain, that's flood zone 3B. So last year, the update of the PPG showed that the starting point now is the 1 in 30 event, which is the 3.3% annual exceedance probability. That's what AEP means. And previously was a 1 in 20 extent. And the SFRA guidance on our .gov.uk pages will be updated shortly to reflect this change. Where you have a windfall site application coming forward on or near existing functional floodplain, take a risk-based approach to requesting the additional information from the applicant's flood risk assessment, depending on the scale and vulnerability of the development and the sensitivity of the catchment in question. And this should establish whether the extent of the functional floodplain has changed for the site under the new definition. For existing building in the functional floodplain, it is legitimate not to consider them part of the functional floodplain. However, it may not be practical to remove individual buildings when producing map. It may therefore be more practical for your local planning policy to set out policies for how development of those existing buildings, including change of use, will be considered with an expectation that footprints will not be increased and that the vulnerability will be reduced in line with Table 2 of PPG. Remember that planning can be an opportunity to address past inappropriate decisions. Statistically, a building in flood zone 3B has 51% chance of flooding from a 3.3% event during a 21-year period, and that increased to 97% chance of flooding during the 100-year design life. So, and that's not even accounting for climate change. This statistic is a probability formula. Can I have the next slide, please? So now we're going to move on to controlling the flood risk. So for the measures that reduce the frequency of flooding and or manage it in a way that prevents it from affecting the property and people. And that can be the one of the most effective approaches. We can have contribution in cash through community infrastructure levy or seal or section 106, and that can help to top up granting aid to deliver strategic flood risk management scheme that can benefit the wider community. The defences can be part of the development proposal, especially for waterfront development. And river restoration as well can help, like removing a culvert or reintroducing a meander. It can help to slow, store, and make space for the water, reducing the risk elsewhere. Can I have the next slide, please? So what makes a development safe? The NPPF is clear that all development in flood risk area has to be made safe for its lifetime without increasing risk elsewhere. Bearing in mind that 25% of our housing stock in the UK is 100 years old. Safety is about the risk to people inside the building, around the buildings, and on access and escape routes to and from the building. A development is not necessarily unsafe if they be subject to hazardous flooding, but it's the combination of hazardous flooding and people being exposed to it that's unacceptable. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you how the hazard is determined using the 1% annual accidents probability event data. In addition, the flood risk assessment should confirm the residual risk from extreme event. That's the 1 in 1,000 or 0.1% annual accidents probability, and establish the safety of the users. In the first instance, we're going to look at avoidance measures to stop people being exposed through site selection, site layout, site levels, development levels, access and escape routes levels. We'll also be looking at control measures to reduce the probability and severity of flooding. People will be exposed to, for example, flood defences, flood storage area, or managed flow routes. Flood warning and emergency plan arrangements for evacuation can play a role in ensuring people aren't exposed to hazardous flooding. People should always be able to safely evacuate the development in a design flood, but that's not to be confused with rescue in terms of safe evacuation. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a flood hazard table, and it's a primarily function of the flood depth and the flood speed. So you can see there that the really shallow flooding can be incredibly dangerous if it's flowing quickly, and equally relatively deep flooding can be fairly innocuous if it's stationary. And 30 centimeter of water or 5 centimeter of stagnant 30 centimeter of stagnant water or 5 centimeter of fast flowing water at 4.5 meter per second can be considered as dangerous for children, the elderly, and the infirm. So the flood risk assessment should clearly detail the hazard using this table that the users of the proposed development would be expected to be exposed to, helping the emergency planners to determine if the proposed evacuation measures are acceptable. Can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of mitigating flood risk, here we've got two examples of recent development proposals, and sometimes they have to be designed to be safe and appropriately flood resistant and resilient throughout the anticipated lifetime. Usually it's 100 years for housing. And on the left-hand side, you can see that the proposal had a contribution to a flood defense scheme, reducing risk to the wider community. And on the right-hand side on the slide, you can see that there was some money towards flood recovery fund. Can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of resistance and resilience, avoidance measures like site selection, site layout, site raising, floor level raising, and moving vulnerable users to upper floors come first. Resistant and resilience measures are unlikely to be suitable as the only mitigation measures to manage the flood risk, but they may be suitable in some circumstances. For example, water compatible and less vulnerable uses where temporary disruption is acceptable and the development remains safe, or where the use of an existing building is to be changed and it can be demonstrated that the avoidance measures set out in paragraph 4 of the PPG are not practical and the development remains safe, or as a measure to manage residual flood risk from flood risk management infrastructure when avoidance measures have been exhausted. Resistance measures seek to keep water out. A passive resistance measure could be a flood door. An active measure would be a demountable barrier and air brick covers. However, you should know that active measures rely on the occupier receiving the flood warning and being able to access the property to install them and maintain them. For example, snails are quite known to be going onto air bricks, and that could affect how tight they are. Also, the webinar last week, my colleague was reminding people about the Boxing Day event in 2015. A lot of people were away from home, so they received the warning, but they were not able to install their floodgates and still flooded. So in terms of resilience measures, they don't attempt to keep the water out, but instead they allow it in, but speed the rate of the recovery. On the bottom photo there, you have the King's Arms pub in York, which frequently floods, but is built with resilient materials, which can be washed and dry quickly after a flood, allowing the business to return business as usual in a matter of days after a major flood. What makes an appropriate level of resistance or resilience varies from case to case, depending on the nature of the risk and the development and other mitigation measures proposed, and should be clearly justified within the flood risk assessment. Developments that could flood frequently, lacking of defenses, and where recoverability is crucial, for example, homes, may need more robust measures than those which are only subject to residual risk and where fast recovery is perhaps less crucial, for example, businesses, or at least more of a choice. There are some useful resources, and we provided a hyperlink there. There is a code of practice that's been published by Syria for property flood resilience. Finally, the flood risk assessment must confirm which flood resistance or resilience measures will be used in the proposed development design. And for a full planning application, we would expect a relevant drawing to show those. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, in terms of looking at the impact on the development of flood risk elsewhere, the PPG guidance provides lots of details in paragraph 49 on how to assess whether or not the development will increase flood risk elsewhere. And he explains that you have to have clear support for compensatory flood storage, how to address the cumulative impacts like land use change and permitted development. That's also made a bit clearer in paragraph 9 and 51 of the PPG. Also, there is a clarification that stilts and voids can mitigate flood risk to development, but should not be considered as compensatory flood storage. And this is because voids do not allow water to freely flow through them. Trash screens get blocked, voids get silted up. They have limited capacity, and it is difficult to stop them being used for storing belongings or other materials. Can I have this next slide, please? So in terms of the second part of this exception test, as defined in the paragraph 164 of the National Planning Policy Framework, there is a recommendation that where possible, the flood risk assessment should demonstrate that flood risk is reduced overall. Paragraph 37 of the PPG provides more detail on this. It clearly sets out that in order to demonstrate that the exception test has been satisfied without securing measures that would reduce flood risk overall, it will need to be demonstrated that such measures cannot be identified or are unfeasible. So we really expect to see flood risk assessment to provide all these details of reducing flood risk or justify otherwise. Can I have the next slide, please? So what makes a development safe? When consulted, the Environment Agency will highlight where a flood risk assessment contains insufficient information on emergency planning and may object on those grounds. We will paint a picture of the risk development may be exposed to, including the flood hazard people may be exposed to on access and escape routes. We will advise consultation with other experts, such as emergency planning teams, the emergency services or local resilience forums, as Andrew mentioned before, and in some cases, reservoir owners. For some sources of flooding, such as surface water flooding, we may advise that others, such as the lead local flood authorities, are better placed to comment on those risks. We will advise on the availability of flood warnings, but we won't guarantee them, and we won't comment on whether or not the warning will provide enough lead time for safe evacuation. Nor will we comment on the acceptability of people sitting out floods in a safe refuge, but we may comment on the likely duration of a flood. We won't advise on the overall adequacy of the emergency plans, the acceptability of the access and escape routes, safe refuge, etc., as we don't perform those roles during a flood incident, nor are we experts on emergency planning capabilities or resources. We don't advise on the structural stability implications of flooding. The exclusion of flood water from buildings of more than 600 millimeter may jeopardize the structural stability of the building, less if water is fast flowing or debris filled. But we're not experts on structural stability and how to design for such condition. And it's important to remember that there has been example of properties collapsing in a near fast-flowing river. There was one during Storm Ciara in the Scottish border in 2020. If you search online, you will find it. There was a collapsed house. Ultimately, the decision on all aspects of safety is with the local planning authority, and in some cases, the planning inspectorate. We work with ADEPT to produce some joint guidance to help the LPAs produce local guidelines on emergency planning and provide a framework for assessing the acceptability of development in their absence. And the link is provided there in the slide. Finally, the flood risk assessment should consider the residual risk as detailed in paragraph 42 of the PPG. If a proposal has a reduced risk due to the presence of flood risk management infrastructure, then the FRA should provide mitigation measures designed to avoid internal flooding from residual risk, whenever possible, and ensure that people are not exposed to hazardous flooding, irrespective of the development vulnerability classification. Can I have the next slide, please? So to manage this flood risk, we have to be able to translate it into a planning condition. So on this slide, we just showed you how you can detail various mitigation measures within that condition, thereby leaving no doubt for the applicant what needs to be done. Absolute rather than relative levels are more precise and enforceable. So usually you can, like on the first point there, you would give the what flood level, floor level should be set at. Most of you should be aware of the planning condition tests set out in paragraph 3 of the planning condition guidance, accessible from the .gov.uk website, where it explains that for a planning condition to be, it should be necessary, relevant to planning, relevant to the development to be permitted. it should be enforceable, precise, and reasonable in all other aspects. Can I have the next slide, please? So just wanted to summarize before we move on to the polls and the quiz, what you need to remember. So firstly, you need to check the incompatibility of the proposal by referring to Annex 3 of the NPPF and the Table 2 of the PPG. So Annex 3 is a vulnerability classification. Secondly, you need to understand if the proposal needs a flood risk assessment as per footnote 55 of the NPPF. Thirdly, you should check the development class referring to paragraph 51 of the PPG. Fourthly, if the site is subject to the exception test after passing the sequential test, you need to ensure the FRA meets the additional policy requirements of paragraph 164 of the NPPF. And finally, you should refer to the flood risk standing advice to see who should be consulted. So now we're going to move on to some case studies and some questions. So the proposal is one dwelling and it's in flood zone 3A. So Sally, you could pop the question. First of all, is to find out whether or not you think the proposed development is incompatible as per Table 2 of the PPG. And I know that can trip up people because we talk about incompatibility. So maybe that's what people struggle with. And then if an FRA is required to support the application, I can see that people are still putting in their answers. And the third question is that if an FRA, if the Environment Agency does not have the estimated flood levels that account for the latest climate change allowances, should the applicant undertake that assessment? Good, we got a resounding yes so far. So I'll take you through the answer. So yes, it's quite interesting how it's split. I think it's because of the wording incompatibility, but no, it's not incompatible. It means that a house is more vulnerable, as according to the PPG. So it is acceptable. It is compatible with flood zone 3A. Obviously, the sequential test and exception test apply, and the local planning authority should ensure that the sequential test has been passed. Yes, an FRA is required to support the application and is needed to pass the exception test. So we need to make sure that it meets the requirement of paragraph 164 of the NPPF. And the third question, yes, the onus is on the applicant to provide the information. How that level is estimated should be justified within the flood risk assessment. For one house, obviously, we have to remember a flood risk assessment is proportionate to the scale and type of proposal. Can I have the next one, please, Sally? So this is a car park in flood zone 3B. So just as a reminder, flood zone 3B is a functional floodplain. So you need to check Annex 3 to look at the vulnerability classification, and then you need to check the Table 2 to see whether or not it's incompatible. So is it incompatible? And I think, again, that is that double negative almost that we're asking, incompatible. So I can see people are still answering. Oh, we got a split here. So I'm just gonna, because I want to give enough time for the Q&A. So yeah, the development is incompatible because it's in a functional floodplain. It's only less vulnerable uses is not permitted in the functional floodplain. So now I'm going to pass back to Andrew for the rest of the case studies and the polls.
Yep. Hi also. On this one, if you could pick one answer. So the case study is, who should the local planning authority consult on major development in flood zone 1, where a strategic flood risk assessment shows it at increased fluvial or river risk in the future from climate change? So just as you're going through this, think about what the risk is, the importance of the SFRA. Think about also earlier on in one of the slides talking about what the footnote 55 says in terms of flood risk assessments. Yeah, I'll just give it a little bit of time for you to respond. Okay, so it's starting to come in now. So the current consultation trigger for the Environment Agency is based on present day risk and the flood map for planning. So the Environment Agency are not consulted on applications in flood zone 1. And the Environment Agency consultation trigger does not take into account the effects of climate change, even if the risk is from rivers or the sea. The lead local flood authority, in this case, should be consulted. This major development in flood zone 1. However, their primary remit to start with will be on the surface water drainage design, not necessarily from increased river risk. So you may wish to ask your lead local flood authority if they wish to be consulted or provide commentary in these cases, but the answer is the lead local flood authority. Because there is future flood risk identified from the SFRA, a flood risk assessment is required in this instance. And it's also worth pointing out that the sequential test would be applicable, but not the exceptions test. Just marrying it back to the webinar from last week. And then next slide, please. Okay, so on this question, we're asking, who must the planning authority consult on non-major residential development, in this case, 0.5 hectare in flood zone 1, that has surface water flood risk identified? It's quite a difficult, complicated setup, so I'll give you a half minute to have a look. Just while you have a look, again, think about what is the flood risk source in this case. Present day, is it future risk? Do we know that? And think about some of the slides earlier on as to who might have responsibility over this flood risk source. Also worth thinking as well about footnote 55. So if you remember, there was a hint earlier on as to when a flood risk assessment may or may not be required. Okay, great. So about 2/3 of you have responded to this one. So half of you have suggested lead a local flood authority. So let's just unpick the scenario a bit and go through the criteria in turn. So it's flood zone 1 with surface water problems. This means the Environment Agency not consulted again on this one, unless it's within 20 meters of the main river. In terms of surface water flood risk, yes, this has been identified, but because it's non-major, the LFA are not a statutory consultee. However, there may be local consultation arrangements in place, which will allow the LFA to provide commentary. The water and sewage companies are not statutory consultees in this case, but again, there may be local arrangements in place. Therefore, the first 4 answers are ruled out. Because surface water flood risk has been identified and the development would result in an increase in its vulnerability, a FRA is still required, which is footnote 55, and the sequential test still needs to be applied. Therefore, the answer is none of the above, but a flood risk assessment is still required. So in such cases, the decision maker might not have access to bespoke expert advice. And in such cases, we'd recommend referring to your SFRA, which could be used in addition to the flood risk assessment checklist we mentioned earlier. And your SFRA may contain a development control section, which provides advice and guidance. You might also be able to consider if your lead local flood authority have any local consultation arrangements, or they may be able to provide some local standard information. Okay, Sandrine, I think you've got one slide left. So back to you.
Yeah, so this one is just whether or not you think the wording of this proposed planning application is suitable or not, and if you would meet those 6 tests. Yeah, I think that was very easy one, that one. So well done, everybody. Yeah, obviously could is not, it should be shall, or it should be more prescriptive and should be more precise as well. You know, we need to be very clear in the conditions. So well done, everybody. I think that concludes our polls and our quizzes. And then we're ready to take some questions.
Okay, thank you both so much. The quick message to everyone, just as you finish these case studies, which is that the fantastic presentations, but this is really complicated, isn't it? And if people are feeling a bit bewildered, please don't in any way feel bad about it. I've been in planning for about 1,000 years. I find this bewildering, okay? And you actually have to be kind of doing it every day, don't you, to be able to build up that experience and familiarity with it. So the fact that there are split answers and the fact that we're getting to grips with it is the reason we're doing these sessions and the reason we've got other resources. We don't have very much time. I'm going to crack on, and I'm going to expect brilliant one-word answers from the Environment Agency team about this. The first one, Andrew, if we could, there were quite a lot of questions about surface water and the sequential test kicking about, which included also surface water mapping and whether that was up to date. One question in particular was saying, well, we're referring to Environment Agency maps mostly that don't include surface water flooding, and most applicants are referring to those. Could you make any very brief comments about the relationship of surface water and sequential test and the state of surface water mapping?
Yeah, so I think it's quite clear that sequential test should take into account surface water. I think that's the easy part of it. There's a lot more sort of guidance we mentioned in last week's webinar on creating a ranking methodology that takes into account surface water and other sources of risk, so that you can create a sequential approach to that, and not just having it as a sequential test based on flood zones. The surface water flood maps, the Environment Agency have produced a nationally consistent picture of surface water flood maps. In some places that takes account of local information produced by the local flood authorities. Those maps are available to use to understand surface water flood risk. I do believe there is the problem with they don't necessarily include allowances for climate change, but the sequential test guidance is quite clear that they should. So in some cases, that information can be improved using local flood risk modelling information. In other cases, as part of kind of local plan or setting up SFRA conversations, it's worth asking the question as to what additional information should be produced. And in this, just following on from that, I'm desperately trying to frame as many into one as I possibly can in a short amount of time. But following on from that, the information that's provided for local planning authorities for flood risk assessments is being fairly frequently updated. Can you please say a word, because there's a couple of questions about where that updated information lies. There's a critical resource, isn't there, that people need to look at for the flood risk allowances. Could you say quickly how often they're updated and when they were last updated? In terms of the climate change allowances, they were last updated 2021. It took into account the latest climate change projections created. I'm not quite sure when the next update is due, but they are constantly under review. So probably in the next few years, you'll see an update. So just to be really clear about that, as a practitioner, my top advice to you all is basically have that website tattooed somewhere about your body. It's absolutely critical that you look at those figures, because we see and come across in training quite a lot of people applying old figures, out of date figures, and it's not necessarily clear that when they're updated, everybody knows they've been updated, and that is that's a challenge. Sandrine, I'm going to come to you with a couple of quick questions, which again reflect a number of questions, which is sort of when is an FRA not an FRA? So it's, first of all, when is one considered to be out of date? That's a question. And secondly, related to it, do you have any advice that could be applied during the validation process as to what an adequate FRA from a developer looks like?
So I thought that the question was about SFRA being out of date. So strategic flood risk assessment is about the maps, and especially with the release of the climate change allowances in 2021. So I will say that, yeah, if you're a FRA, you know, maybe to bring that update a bit sooner. In terms of an adequate flood risk assessment for the validation process is really to follow that FRA checklist on our .gov.uk website. And we have put, I think it's in, I'm pretty sure it's embedded within the presentation. So it's really that to follow the hierarchy, which Andrew showed, you know, have they assessed all the sources of flooding? Have they showing what clear mitigation, how they're going to manage the risk, and then to show whether or not it's going to be safe. In terms of the safety, like I said, is about consulting with your colleague, emergency planner or local resilience forum. So usually as well is to see who prepared the flood risk assessments. You know, many times we see architects or planning agents having a go at it. And, you know, I mean, it depends what the risk is, but more often than not, we need to be, it should be a consultant, somebody who understands how to interpret the data. So more often than not, those flood risk assessments are not going to be adequate.
Okay, and I want you to know that I don't understand what the right qualification to do that assessment would be. I'm not going to ask you that question now because I think maybe there isn't, but presumably there is a standard for doing that. I just want to make it clear that, you know, it's not actually, I don't think, completely self-evident. Right, we're coming to a close, and there is an awfully brilliant high-tech technical question to torture the Environment Agency with before we finish, and it's open to all Environment Agency staff, and I'll just read it out. The suggested planning conditions slide suggests finished floor levels are set 600 millimeters above the 1% AEP event, but the GovDoc standing advice states finished floor levels should be a minimum of 300 millimeters above estimated river or sea level. I hate questions like that. It's a brilliant question. Who's right and who's wrong? Can anyone help us?
I can answer. So it's because we want to update the guidance externally, and really we want to start from that position of having a more generous freeboard of 600 millimeter.
Okay.
And then if it can be justified as a lower freeboard because we got confidence in the flood risk level, and in terms of what the flood risk is, and if there are other constraints like access, you know, disability access, then obviously that can be, but it has to be justified. But the starting point should be 600 and then work our way down. I think it's better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going to draw this to a close because we promise, you're all very busy people, and we promised this would be an hour. Just to thank the Environment Agency, and my apologies for torturing you all with those final questions, to point to these resources that might be useful to you, and also perhaps the assessment of this session, which is also available, which is also useful to us in framing the future training. And I'll just finish as we come to a close by thanking you all for your attendance. Please look out for the rest of the resources that will emerge from this training, from these training resources going forward, which we really hope will be useful. But I want to speak directly to those people under a lot of stress and pressure in local planning authorities. The way I approach this professionally is by rules of thumb. There is immense amount of technical detail here, but the strongest critical moment about the culture of decision-making around climate change is to recognize that we have now locked into the system severe and long-lasting impacts, which will result in a whole series of events, which means we have to take a very precautionary approach. Sandrine's last answer, I think, reflects the culture of that, which is, if in doubt, play safe. If in doubt, go for the highest requirements, because ultimately people will not be able to insure their homes or live safely if you can't fulfill that function. You are the thin green line on this issue. If a regulatory failure takes place at the planning stage, then individual property, communities, and people will be at long-lasting risk, which is not to pile the pressure on. It's just to say how absolutely vital your jobs are and the work that you do on this. We're not always going to get it right, but be cautious is the answer, because this is unfortunately only going to go one way. Thank you all so much for listening to this session. We will reflect on the many questions that we've had and attempt to deal with as many of those in the advice we're producing as we go forward in the next couple of months. So thank you all again, and you can now get on with your day. Thank you.